Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our event. Like I said earlier, for those who are just tuning in, my name is Dallas Fiddler. I am going to be one of the hosts today, but shortly, in a few moments, I'm going to be changing it, switching it over to Springwater to moderator panel. The orange shirt in the Orange Shirt Day refers to the new shirt that Phyllis Websan was given to her by her grandmother for her first day of school at St. Joseph Mission Residential School in British Columbia. When Phyllis got to school, they took away her clothes, including her new shirt. It was never returned. To Phyllis, the color orange has always reminded her of her experience in residential school. And as she said, how my feelings didn't matter, no one cared, and I felt like I was worth nothing. All of us little children were crying and no one cared. So that is a little bit of the significance behind the orange shirt. And these last few months for a lot of us here in IMJ and Indigenous people across the country have been difficult. They have been difficult, as you've seen on the recent news finding of the unmarked graves. And so I want to invite everyone here to join me before I pass it on to Murray to do an opening prayer for a moment of silence for the children that were found recently in the unmarked graves, but also all of the children who never made it home. Thank you. I am now, as opposed to passing it on to Murray, I'm going to pass it on to Donna Kennedy to do the opening prayer.
Thank you for having me to say the opening prayer for this important gathering. First of all, I want to read a verse from Psalms 71:18. It says, "Now also, when I am old and gray-headed, O God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation, your power to everyone who is to come. We long to see a revival in our nations and to see God's vision for families restored." So let's bow our heads. Ksemanadu kakasewat bien. Thank you. Kitinan we kamamos nyang dotemak. And is kagwetumnan koyak we jisek na ka nabutaman. Lord, we thank you for bringing us together today in good health and peace, and that we will discuss important things in a good way. We thank you for the grandfathers and grandmothers of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you in the good way. Minchang Chihamanan. So maga gamina kumak unago nungom egamina wabang. Egamina, thank you katuku ka magas kajiayang ekminchiang nuden nepe iskute egamin akka. We thank you for giving us the winds, water, fire, and earth. Egamina kamamonchiang and wandagaunjiang. He waited nung wabanung sawanung egamina pangshamung. We thank you for the friends that have gathered from the north, east, south, and west. Negua is the Emma is the and the Mayang with Juichi Siang, Tun the Mang, Egamina Unen Tikeun Jiayang dehinang. We seek guidance to understand and to have forgiveness in our hearts. Mis we disnam agad pangstiang kwe megats animentamon gap megats gap mstiang apetsak ze big thing dehinang. Ega where is the bank, the bank, help us to not falter in our steps as we go through this storm when our hearts have been broken, and that we understand your love for all. Is ego min wages the bank where kakinap matun maaking keen and that all life on earth was in your plan. Examine to mawasak kaknawasak. Ego kakisa kanama saat ngchihamak ego mina ksabad negan kainatek to yeah, where does Yapamiang nog taunan? Examine to Tweety Yang where Kagis back. Egamina, thank you. As taught by my elders and the teachings of the Bible, we ask the Most High, our Father, to be with us in our gathering today. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. We pray. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Donna, for taking the time to be here today, and then also taking the time to come say a prayer on behalf of this event. Yeah, my language, Nanaskamun. I'm going to pass it on over to Ren to do a little bit of a housekeeping. And then from there, we will I will ask Ren to just pass it on over to Springwater, and then we can get the panel going.
Thank you, Dallas. So welcome, folks. My name is Ren Ito, and I will be moderating the chat and handling tech support for today's call. And so I just wanted to name a few things up front. Our panelists, as Dallas mentioned, are going to begin sharing in a second, and that'll take up the bulk of our time, at the end of which there will be a 15 or so minute Q&A session. We'll be gathering questions in the chat for that Q&A session to pose to the panel. So if you have questions, we're asking you to pose them in the chat, and please hold off on your questions until closer to the end. I will prompt you in the chat when it's time to share your questions. So if someone says something or sparks something and you have a question, please just hang on to that. And you can ask it closer to the end of our time, just to keep the chat freer for conversation. And also just a note, please remember that the panelists are here today to share from their experiences and their expertise. So the focus of today's event is on the content of what they are bringing to share, and not on the panelists' personal experiences, and particularly not on their personal sufferings or traumas. So please be very mindful of this as you engage with the panel and with one another in the chat. When posing questions during the Q&A, please do not ask any personal or invasive questions, for example, about traumas, about family or adoption circumstances, things of that nature. And in general, we're just asking you to please be respectful of one another and to enter into this conversation from a place of openness and care. The chat will remain open and I will be monitoring it. As panelists are sharing, please feel free to engage in conversation with one another. And again, I will be prompting you when the Q&A session is about to start. So that's it from me, and I'll pass it back to Springwater.
We usually don't, yeah, we're going to start this panel very shortly. Springwater just messaged me and said she got booted out. So that's kind of funny. Brutal timing, but she should be arriving shortly. But in the meantime, I'm going to very briefly have the panelists introduce themselves. So I'm going to start on my right, and we're going to start with Leanne.
I'm Leanne Shimoda. I'm from Saugeen First Nation and Cape Croker, and I reside in Ottawa, Ontario. And I'll pass it over to Murray.
Tanse, my name is Reverend Murray Pruden. I am the Executive Minister for Indigenous Ministries and Justice for the United Church of Canada. And I bring you greetings on behalf of the United Church of Canada and our office. And I'm calling in from Vancouver, British Columbia on the West Coast. I'm Cree, I'm Nihiel from Treaty 6 territory in Alberta from the Goodfish Lake Sad Lake First Nations. And I'll pass this on to Allison. Oh, Allison, you're muted.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. My name is Allison Jane Forsberg, and I am Cree from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I will pass it on to
Does that mean?
Donna, sorry.
Okay.
Okay, Jocelyn, you could go ahead and speak.
Hi, everyone. Jocelyn Formsma, Executive Director of the National Association of Friendship Centers. We're a network of over 100 local and provincial territorial friendship centers across the country in every province and territory except for PEI. And I am from Moose Cree First Nation in Northern Ontario.
So I guess it's over to me. I just about had a heart attack. I got booted out of the Zoom meeting. I think Dallas did that for kicks. Again, my name is Springwater Hester-Meawassige. I am from Serpent River First Nation. I live in Toronto. I am your moderator for this evening. I work at the United Church of Canada with the Indigenous Ministries Circle as the Youth Leadership Coordinator. So when our unit first started to have conversations about, what kind of event we were hoping to host, I wanted to push the envelope a little bit. Much of the work that we engage in with the church is very much focused on, the church-run, government-sanctioned institutions, which is more commonly known as the residential school system. For all my working career, I have worked with Indigenous young people and their families. And I really, really wanted to highlight a few, really important things. And one of them that I'm really hoping that the audience will begin to think critically about is that, since Confederation to present day, the child welfare policies, even though they have evolved and they've shifted over time, they haven't evolved so much where Indigenous families are intact. We as a people, in terms of our children being apprehended, we have not had an opportunity to pause and catch our breath. So with this, I'm going to direct my first question over to Murray. The United Church of Canada has been actively engaged in the work of reconciliation and has been working hard to educate its members on the residential school system. This evening, we are going to be shifting the conversation a bit so we can learn about the continuum that exists between the residential school system to the Sixties Scoop and now to the Millennial Scoop. Why do you think it's important for us to have these conversations with United Church members?
Thank you, Springwater. Maybe I'll just backtrack a little bit and maybe give a little bit of background to maybe some of the ideas and things that have been moving forward with the United Church of Canada, and in the areas of the non-Indigenous and the Indigenous mindset and leadership. But with the United Church of Canada, it's known that we operated 15 of the residential schools covered by the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, and accounting for approximately 10% of Indigenous children who are forced to attend them. And a history of our involvement as the United Church is available on our website, and it's also created by the United Church Archives. But since 1998, the response by the United Church to the role we played in the system has been guided by the wisdom of residential school and intergenerational survivors. And then back in 2003, the Residential Schools Steering Committee, later the Committee of the Indigenous Justice and Residential Schools, established 6 principles of the reconciliation, which we see to continue to guide us in this work. And the principle of community involvement guides how we are responding to Indigenous ministries and such, that we, like you mentioned, Springwater, there's a since the knowing of the Kamloops situation and with the unmarked graves, we've been placed in a time of trauma and reflection and grieving. It has become a time of respect, but also with that reminder that as a greater church, we responded to that request by our Indigenous membership and by Indigenous peoples. But as the United Church of Canada, we stated our commitment to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when they were issued in June of 2015, and that includes the calls to action 73 to 76, which deal with the burial sites and missing children. And we've already worked with communities in commemorating known grave sites in Brandon and Edmonton, File Hills, Red Deer, and Regina. And these calls to action state very clearly that the Indigenous communities most affected must lead in the development of such strategies, and that their protocols must be followed. And we're aware that unmarked graves may be found on United Church properties, but we're committed to working on them continuously and on unknown burial sites as well, and following the principles laid out by these calls of action. I also want to add in the Indigenous church response too, and our point of view is that we've taken this placement of honoring this time of mourning, of reflection and reaction, and that is really where we're at in the guidance of our National Indigenous Council and our National Elders Council. It's just that we're just not ready to speak and ready to give full reflection to the matters. Back at the end of June of this summer, the National Indigenous Elders Council stated that we're not ready. A shared statement would be one of our elders saying, "My heart is still bleeding." So we're taking our time with this, and this is part of our ways, a consensus way of working together. But the message is clear, and even from my point of view and from my office, is that the greater church is urged to take responsibility for what it's done. I'll leave that as that, but I'll continue on to talk about what your question was alluding to. Why is it important for the United Church in particular? It has a lot to do with this understanding and education. Education is a full placement of it. Is that we're seeing and finding that I don't want to even just say the United Church community in the greater stance of it, but Western community, the Canadian society, still isn't in full understanding of what the significance is of our missing children, of the residential school history, and even the actions of the Truth and Reconciliation pathway. Like, there is still needed education on this, and I always take this to heart because, and especially when we talk about TRC, Truth and Reconciliation, we're given the reconciliation back in 2015, but the truth did not follow. And now we're at this point of truth. And I think this is where we as the United Church, are able to uphold that and educate ourselves and take that action, because this is also a learning of our history with truth, but it was also an understanding of a path of equity, being able to walk side by side as we were meant to be. And intergenerational trauma is also being well received, but also needs to be learned amongst everybody, both in the Indigenous community and non-Indigenous community. And exactly what does that mean, and how can we make some better understandings to all this? But I just want to end with a statement about why this orange shirt that we all wear and honoring and remembering it's about children. It doesn't matter, whose children it is, it's children. Like these are the little people that we are supposed to be taking care of. We're supposed to be showing them this gift of life and spirituality. And I think that is where everyone's responsibility should be upheld.
Okay, thank you, Murray. Over to Leanne. Leanne, I'm wondering if you might take a few moments to tell the audience a little bit about the 60s Scoop. When did it start and when did it end? And yeah. You're muted.
We're all bad at that, aren't we? The 60s Scoop was a period in which a series of policies were enacted in Canada that enabled child welfare authorities to take or scoop Indigenous children from their families and place them within white families. The process began in 1951 when amendments to the Indian Act gave the provinces jurisdiction over Indigenous child welfare when none existed federally. It is estimated that over 20,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families and fostered or adopted out primarily to white middle-class families as part of the 60s Scoop. In the 1950s, Indigenous children made 1% of children in care, and by the late 1960s, they represented a third of the children in care. Approximately 70% of those children were placed into non-Indigenous families. Under Article 2E of the United Nations Convention on Genocide, child apprehension became viewed as a successor to the residential school system as a new form of cultural genocide. Forcibly transferring children of a group to another group constitutes genocide when the intent is to destroy a culture. When I look at pictures of residential schools and day schools, I see Indigenous faces. When I look at pictures of my school classes, I see one brown face amongst 36 white faces. When I look at pictures of my grandchildren's classes now in 2021, I see a plethora of color spectrum of faces. It reminds me of how truly alone we were as 60s Scoop children. We had no culture, we had no one that looked like us. We were brown in a white world. Returning to the brown world in my 40s, I discovered I was an apple, which meant that I was white on the inside and brown on the outside, which meant that I wasn't welcome in that world either. We ended up orphans, not belonging to either world. We often feel lost and alone. Thanks, Springwater.
Thank you, Leanne. Allison, I'm just wondering if you can share a bit about your experience as being, a young First Nations youth today. I'm just wondering, when you think about your experiences going to school, for recreational activities, going to the doctor's office and so forth, would you say that these people who, are supporting you in your school curriculum, in your medical health, in your recreational, are they responsive to your needs as a First Nations young person?
Okay, so beginning, I want to touch on the topic, as Leanne spoke, being one of the only Indigenous people in her classrooms. I grew up with the same situation as well. I'm adopted and my parents are Caucasian. They have raised me to be very, very aware of where I come from as a First Nations individual. And I also want to thank Leanne for having the strength to share that with the attendees here today. I feel like it's really important to get those stories out and create an understanding. So thank you, Leanne. Yes, so education system for me growing up, I was one of the only Indigenous people in my classroom from kindergarten to grade 6. And it was definitely a challenge. I felt like I never really fit in with my First Nations culture and as well with the people who were Caucasian in my class. So just finding that balance between who I am and where I come from was a challenge, but for sure my parents made sure I was proud of who I am and understood where I came from. As I got older, I definitely started to be more insightful of, I guess, the assumptions made about me. So being a teenager and being First Nations, it's always that expectation you'd come to class high or skip class, not do your homework and stuff. And education for me has always been super, super important. It's a bit of a challenge too. Like I have very high expectations of myself and try to succeed where I can. But if the teachers or the school system doesn't have those expectations that you're not there to succeed, it's hard and gives you, yes, lack of faith in yourself. If these people doubt me, it's like, what's the point of trying? I'm very lucky to have been aware of my strength and stand up for myself. But as for other youth nowadays, how do you find that strength or how do you stand up for yourself? You just take in those stereotypes and don't really prove yourself. And I'm not saying it's like we have to prove ourselves constantly because it's a tough challenge for sure. But the school system definitely needs to work on empowering their students and their youth into more healthy environments that they're there to see them succeed. So yes.
Thank you, Allison. Over to Jocelyn. I'm just wondering if you might be able to tell the audience what is the current state of Indigenous children's rights today, and how are they being protected, or how are they not being protected?
I would say the framework is pretty limited in terms of what we have concrete for upholding Indigenous children's rights. So just a little bit of background. So even though I mentioned I'm the executive director of the National Association of Friendship Centers, I'm also a lawyer and called to the bar in Ontario. And Indigenous children's rights and youth engagement has been something I've studied for the last 10, 15 years. I was a youth rep at one point, back when I was younger, at least. And so I did a lot of advocacy as a youth for other youth in those days. And now that I've, I guess, become an adult, I still continue to ensure that that we have youth engagement in any conversations that we're having. So I've studied a little bit about the framework that we have. we don't have any kind of like national or federal well-being framework. We don't have a collective vision of what it is that we want to see for Indigenous children. I mean, which is fine to a certain extent because, you know, First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities are all different and unique, and wherever they're located, the situations are going to be slightly different. However, I think as a country, we can identify and we can agree to certain principles of Indigenous child well-being. So I know we'll talk about it a little bit later, but this idea of raising an entire generation that doesn't have to apologize for its actions, right? And a lot of times we're looking at the past and what we did wrong and how can we learn for the future. But I think we also need to remember that the decisions that we make today are going to be the future for other people. It's going to be our future, but it's also going to be the future for other people. So if for those of us who would think, you know, maybe they would have done something differently during the residential school era, maybe they think if I had been there, I think I could have done something different, something better. I need you to think about that today and what that is you would do differently, because probably you can do something differently today and now that will have a positive effect on children that are born today, this week, this year, and think about where they're going to be in the next 10, 20 years. So yeah, in terms of a legislation framework, we don't have a legislation at all regarding Indigenous child well-being. Federal funding programs are pretty limited, and in terms of advocacy or anything, it's very piecemeal, and so there's nothing comprehensive. We're not measuring it. We don't have an evaluation framework. So all of those things really are factors that lead into the state of Indigenous children's rights today. I'll just note there's a question about what is the Friendship Center. I'm going to put a link here, but essentially the Friendship Center started about 70 years ago as grassroots, community-driven entities that just created community and connection for Indigenous peoples who were in the cities. So back in those days, you can imagine our first founders sat around kitchen tables and basements trying to organize themselves and trying to connect people that were coming into the city with services, with supports, even just getting together to have a cup of tea in Bannock and say, you know, how can we get you what you need? How can we make you feel more at home in the city? Today we have, as I mentioned, over 100 sites from coast to coast to coast in every region in Canada. And we still kind of keep that core providing connection and community for people, but basically we're community centers by and for Indigenous people living in urban spaces. And by urban, you know, basically anything that's not on reserve, that's Inuit, serving Inuit outside of the north and Métis outside of Métis homelands.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I'm just going to ask a question in response to something you had just highlighted. I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak very briefly about, you know, the situation for Indigenous children that are on reserve versus those who are off, and you know, some of the legislations that may or may not exist that might you know, protect and uphold their rights, or maybe they don't.
Yeah, it's a bit of I'd say there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. It's so piecemeal and there's no comprehensive anything. And there has been some work started with the Indigenous early learning and childcare, but that is very specific to like education and childcare, right? Like we're not talking about the full spectrum of rights. So basically, the framework of rights that I use when I'm talking about Indigenous children and youth engagement is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think it's important to note that these were just documents that articulated existing rights. So they basically looked around the world and identified what are the rights that exist for children in the case of the convention, and what are the rights that exist for Indigenous people. So they didn't create any rights, they didn't make them up or anything like that. These are just these documents are just a statement of what the rights are. And I think it's important because I feel like with the history of the residential schools, the 60s Scoop, the ongoing Millennial Scoop, and the child welfare system today, I kind of look at it as like a sad program or a sad system, but I just look at it as generations of rights violations that as Indigenous peoples, we have the rights to lands, to cultures, to language. We have the right to practice our own cultures. We have the right to govern ourselves and accordingly. Those are just rights that exist, and those are rights that exist for Indigenous children as well. As children, they have the right to life, the right to health, the right to education, quality education. And as Indigenous children, they have the rights to be educated in their own language and their own cultures. So at every step, since Canada has existed, we have not built a framework that allows us to uphold those rights. And in fact, for many decades and many generations, what we had were systems that actively violated the rights of Indigenous children again and again and again in many, many different ways. So when we're looking forward, if we take the rights that we know that exist, and then we just start building on what we know works, which is usually, community driven with supported by resources. I think that's the pathway that I want to go forward is just start with what we know, start with what works, and build from there. And I'm always a big fan of, following community, following young people. And so if churches are wondering, how do we help and how do we support, I really see that being a pathway, at least, is by not stepping forward as the leaders in this area, but stepping forward saying, we have some work to do. We're committed to it. We're committed to it long term. How can we be of most assistance? And knowing the history, it's going to be some very challenging conversations at times, but I think entities that are truly committed to reconciliation will be willing to have those hard conversations and still stay at the table until the work is done.
Thank you. I guess this next question will be directed to anyone who feels called to answer it. I'm just wondering if maybe Leanne or Jocelyn or Allison would like to let the people who are here tonight know about what is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and what exactly is the federal government contesting?
So I can answer that one. So like I described, I'm from the Sixties Scoop. So it took me till I was like 60 to find a real passion in life where I could take my experience as being an Indigenous person and also fitting well into the non-Indigenous population. So I got a job with Jordan's Principle. And Jordan's Principle is a result of a young fellow from out west passing away because the federal government and the provincial government couldn't agree as to who was responsible for his care. So his care never got taken care of, and he ended up passing away, never having lived in a home setting. He passed away in a hospital. So Jordan's Principle was named in honor of Jordan River Anderson. And is looked after a lot with lobbying by Dr. Cindy Blackstock from the Caring Society. And so she took it to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and won her decision. And that is how Jordan's Principle was founded. It's a child first principle that is to eliminate service gaps and service inequalities that are experienced by our First Nation children. The reason that the government so they ordered the Canadian government to start providing funding to make better equitable care for First Nation children on and off reserve. The issue became that the federal government doesn't want to take responsibility for all the children that are mandated under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So it's been taken back and forward to court to get it straightened away. So today is a big day because today Judge Favell upheld two major decisions that impact our First Nation children. One is for First Nation children that have been removed from their home on reserve after January 1st, 2006, and were unable to access funding through Jordan's Principle because of the government's limited interpretation on that order between December 12th, 2007 and 2017. So that was a big ruling in our favor as a result of looking at the policies and recommendations under the TRC ruling. And the other one is a huge victory for our children that live off First Nations. So Jordan's Principle is available for any First Nation child who's under the age of 18, who is status or eligible for status. And the new rulings enable children who do not have status, will never have status, but have a parent or guardian that has status or is eligible status are now eligible for Jordan's Principle. And that's the ruling that the government was fighting with the order until today. And then the other policy that was also instated is that a First Nation, just solely for the purpose of Jordan's Principle, can recognize an Indigenous child as part of their First Nation in order for them to access Jordan's Principle funding. So I think what people often get confused when they're thinking about Jordan's Principle is that it's a program. And it's not a program, it's an order by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on the Government of Canada and on the provinces across Canada. The funding comes to the First Nations through their Health Canada agreements and is unlimited. So just to make you understand the scope of it, as a navigator myself, I handle last year I did $5 million worth of requests. And this year I'm up to $4 million and I'm halfway through the year. So as individuals become aware of Jordan's Principle, more and more people are requesting funding. And it's the government that has the ability to approve or deny requests. The requests can be anything from a bicycle to needing respite worker, to needing health equipment, to needing to be an adoptee who needs to go home and visit their home community and get connected with their roots. So it's a great source of funding out there at the moment. Thanks, Springwater.
I can add a little bit of context to that as well. So I was working for the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society right before they launched the human rights complaint. So worked on a lot of the background of it. And so I think what's important is there was an identified gap between what could be provided to First Nations children on reserve and off reserve. This had been well documented in numerous research studies, community child welfare, First Nations child welfare agencies had brought this issue forward numerous times to government, saying, look, you are paying us right now to remove children and you provide us no resources to keep children safely in their homes and provide prevention services. And so what you're doing is you're making it so there's actually an incentive to remove Indigenous children so that they can access services, programs, equipment, health supports. Whereas if they were a non-Indigenous child, they would have those provided for them without having to be removed and go into care. So yeah, like I said, research reports documented by grassroots and frontline service agencies, but nothing was really working. And so the cost of litigation can be quite high, hiring lawyers and that kind of thing. So the Human Rights Tribunal seemed to be a valid option that was more affordable. It didn't turn out to be that way, but that was the thinking at the time. So the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, along with the Assembly of First Nations, applied to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, said this is such an important issue to Canada that we need to make this right. And the Human Rights Commission agreed and referred it to the tribunal, and had been litigated over 10, 15, more than 15 years, almost 20 years now. This idea of equality of supports and services based on residency and who you are was very, very important. That what we had was a very disproportionate system that incentivized child removal, that provided no resources to communities or frontline agencies or community organizations to help the families keep children safely in their homes. And I will note that it's still this case, and we got the most recent study just in the last few months, that the drivers of children going into child welfare are three things. They are, the number one issue is neglect. So child abuse, physical, sexual, any kind of abuse actually is quite rare. The number one driver is neglect. And when you break down neglect, it's those three things. It's a lack of housing, proper housing. It is substance misuse that is connected to intergenerational trauma from things like the Sixties Scoop in the residential schools. And it's poverty. It's because the family can't afford food, it can't afford supplies for children in education. And when we look at that term and we look at those three things, we realize that it's not actually because these children are being harmed. They're being removed because of the intergenerational effects of what they felt because of those rights violations. They're poor, they need better housing, and they need better supports to deal with intergenerational trauma. So we have the ability now to turn that around. The tribunal case, even though it's been a driver of change, it's always been within the power of the federal government and Canadians across the country to make a system that actually works better for First Nations kids and doesn't leave them behind.
Thank you for that, Jocelyn and Leanne. So Leanne, you actually answered my my next question, which was I was asking, what is Jordan's principle? You know, so you did a good job of you know, letting people know what it is. I just wanted to kind of briefly summarize from what I know of Jordan's principle. As you mentioned, you know, it is a legal requirement resulting from the orders of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and it is not a policy or program. Jordan's principle is a child first principle that aims to eliminate service inequities and delays for First Nations children. Jordan's principle states that any public service ordinarily available to all other children must be made available to First Nations children without delay or denial. So this all sounds really nice. I'm just wondering, are those service inequities and delays now fully resolved?
No, no. Unfortunately, even an order can't resolve those issues. Part of it is there's a difference between being on reserve and off reserve, like Jocelyn was mentioning. And it also flows the other way as well, where there's benefits that living on reserve you have that you don't have when you reside off reserve as an Indigenous person as well. So Jordan's principle, it works at those inequities as well. I think the biggest issue with the government viewing it is that they don't want to pay out of their pockets for meeting the needs of our Indigenous children. So that becomes a real battle with the government in looking at those issues. And that's not going to be solved anytime soon because the issues are still there. We still have inadequate housing. We have the water issues on the First Nation. We have housing that's made on less than good quality land. So a lot of our houses have mold issues. Like Jocelyn mentioned, there's addiction issues, there's poverty issues. Certainly COVID has played a huge role on the number of requests coming to Jordan's principal because employment has gone down. It's harder to find a job. You're out of work because COVID closes everything down again. We have a lot of grandparents that are raising children, so they're trying to raise children on their old age pensions, which is then again a direct result of the historical traumas of residential school and our lack of learning parenting while we were institutionalized. We're still seeing the results of that, and that certainly plays a part in the funding that flows through Jordan's principal. Thanks, Springwater.
Could I add something to that? Yeah, okay. So what we've done in this country is something very silly, in my opinion, is that we decided that depending upon where you lived, you belong to a different level of government. So not that anybody here wants to learn about the Canadian Constitution, but I'll try to keep this as interesting as possible. So in our Constitution, we have what's called a separation of powers. The provinces sat down with the federal government when they were developing the Constitution, 1982, said, okay, what are you going to take care of and what are we going to take care of? And so there's literally a list in the Constitution. So things like healthcare, child welfare, education. They said the provinces, we're going to take care of that because it makes more sense for us to do it because we're closer to the people that are actually in our community. So we're going to take on that responsibility. But anything related to, and this is the term still in the Constitution, that relates to Indians and lands reserved for the Indians, that's a federal responsibility. So the federal government has the responsibility, and we've had Supreme Court cases that define the term Indian. So under the term Indian, Indians mean status and non-status. So people who hold a status card that says a certified Indian. I have one, it's in my purse, that says I'm a certified Indian that expire. I think I expire next year. I don't know what's going to happen when I expire, but I expire and we'll see what happens. And non-status, so people for whatever reason that was determined by the Indian Act and federal government again, could not gain status. And really status allows, that basically just says you're, you have eligibilities to certain programs based on your Indian status. But Indian also means that federal government has responsibility for Métis and Inuit. Those were Supreme Court cases that were decided that said Indian also means Métis and Inuit. Now, this is where the problem happens, is when you have an Indian child, status, non-status, Métis or Inuit, who doesn't live on a land reserved for Indians, what happens then? What happens when they need money for education? What happens when they need money for child welfare? That's really what happened with Jordan and his family, and why we have Jordan's principle, because they still fight to this day over who's responsible, and who basically gets to foot the bill. And if you were any other child in Canada, they don't have those fights about what you need. They get you what you need, and then they decide later how to pay for it. And that happens today with urban Indigenous children, and young people and people in general. That we saw it in COVID, because I was on phone calls with many people in those early days of COVID, where and money was announced for folks, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit that were on reserve or in the north or through Métis governments. And they said, urban, you need to call the provinces. And I said, these are still Indigenous peoples. You still have federal responsibility to ensure that they are as safe as they can be. And organizations like ours were opening up the doors and providing the service without any guarantee that they were going to, go under, or, they didn't worry about the money. They just worried on trying to help people. But then the provinces said, well, it's not our responsibility. You're urban Indigenous, you're federal responsibility. And the federal government said, you're urban Indigenous, you're actually provincial responsibility. And so it was about 6 weeks before we heard that anybody was going to come up with some funding to ensure that people were safer, they had food, that they were able to make their medical appointments and transportation. And that still happens in education and all those other areas that I mentioned. Even though we have Jordan's principle, they still fight tooth and nail over who's not going to pay for it, which I don't mind taking up those fights as a national organization. I feel like that's part of my role, but it should never be on the shoulders of somebody who's already struggling, a single mom, trying to get food for her kids, or trying to get her kids enrolled in a recreation program that, otherwise would be available. That shouldn't fall on the shoulders of people in community. That should be up to governments who have vast resources to be able to address those. And I think the last thing I want to say on that, it's not always about the money. It's people are saying, well, how much money? It's about the quality of the service, and it's about the ability for people to meet their needs, and it's about upholding rights. And that's going to take resources, it's going to take money, it's going to take time, it's going to take a lot of things. But I don't think we need to lose focus. We cannot lose focus of the fact that we're talking about upholding people's basic human rights, and that we're ensuring that the rights of Indigenous people and children are upheld as well. And my dog Loki agrees with me, because that's what she says when she's barking.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I just want to ask Allison a quick question. After listening to what we've listened to so far, what are your thoughts?
Mine, for sure. Jordan's principle, I've had experiences with them too. Because I am adopted and I have 8 other siblings who are adopted as well. My mom tries very, very hard to make sure we have the same resources as other people who are whites. Braces was a big thing for sure, because we don't live on reserve and we are status. We applied for Jordan's principle to see if we could get funding for it, because it's 5 of us have had braces and 3 of them are still coming to get theirs. And it's just a lot of money. And because of issues with intergenerational trauma and addiction to alcohol, that causes issues with FASD. And because of that, it's been scientifically proven bone structure is very different compared to those without FASD. So that does affect the jaw and does affect the development. And it's how do my siblings feel secure and comfortable in their bodies if that resource is basically being denied from the government? But as for a good thing Jordan's principle have done, I think it was 4 years ago now. My mom helped put on a youth conference for Indigenous youth across Saskatchewan. So we brought youth from different reserves to Saskatoon, and we stayed at the Chapel Lodge Hotel. And it was a weekend, so 3 days, and we had some speakers come and just talk about how to write a petition to the government, because you don't need to be 18. Being in contact with like their culture and being connected to who they are as an individual, that was very empowering. And with Jordan's Principle, we did have that funding to, I guess, empower these youth and show that they're capable of so much more. For me, I was very lucky to have that growing up, but I understand that many other youth may not have the same opportunities. So it's like planting seeds, and it's what they take from it and what they want to do. It's not like a force thing, like, here, we're going to give you the resources to help you. You have to use that to go and do this. Like, it's not like that at all. It's like, here are the resources, you do with what you feel comfortable and what you think will help you grow. Yeah, this past summer, I've been doing a lot of activism for youth stuff. So the Council Canada Day event in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, after hearing about the unmarked graves, it was just a big shock to me. And I had a discussion with my mom, who's always been my main support person, and making sure that I had the resources I need, which I'm very thankful for. I put together the events called Bring Them Home. And there was many other organizations going on and planning their own events, but they're groups of people, maybe 25 and plus. But being someone who was 18, I felt very unsure, like, what my platform was and how I could find myself in helping the community grow and helping to have that space for healing. The largest number of people who turned up was over 4,000, and I think it's like really insane to hear and see that like youth can accomplish such big things and projects if we work together. And so that's where I found a lot of my collaborations with other like-minded people like me. So same with like activism, it's like planting those seeds to help other youth and show that they could use their own platforms. My friend Bialang Tony came to me this summer and asked how he could help in reconciliation and how he could help grow his knowledge. So he biked around to every federally recognized residential school in Saskatchewan and raised over, I think, 5,000, 10,000, I have no idea. $10,000 for the Orange Shirt Society. And my thing for me is just helping other youth find their platforms. And Jordan's Principle was a big step. I was 14 at that time. To help inspire other youth. So Jordan's Principle was a big help at the start of my journey.
Thank you, Allison. Okay, so I did have two more questions to ask, but we're only going to ask one because I want to make sure that people who are attending tonight have an opportunity to ask. So what we're going to do is if everyone can answer, maybe we'll go Murray, Leanne, Allison, and Jocelyn, if that's okay. Jocelyn had mentioned earlier this evening that Cindy Blackstock, she often speaks about, raising an entire generation of First Nation young people where the government does not have to apologize. In 1 minute, maybe a minute and a half, what needs to happen?
Okay, well, you're asking a minister to say something in 1 minute. I don't know if that can happen, but I'll try my best here. So I think from the lens from the United Church, we know being a social justice church, we have the abilities to be advocates and educators in this, and further proper education of Indigenous children, actions, proper rights for Indigenous people, supportive advocacy for safe and healthy families, because this is part of the intergenerational effects that happen to Indigenous peoples. Learn from our Indigenous ways, learn our languages. This is a huge one for me, because that's also been felt within our Indigenous membership, that we need this pathway of languages, and is a way to greet one another in this way too. And this is another intergenerational loss that needs to be overcome. And from there, it kind of overlaps and ripples out to learn of our treaties, to learn the basics of our treaties, because I think those are really core to a lot of things and understandings. Meet your neighbor, and by that I mean learn about the friendship centers like that Jocelyn represents across Canada, and other area Indigenous organizations that support the needs for children, for Indigenous children, for families. And also look at laws, and keep looking at the laws and government, and keep questioning all our leadership, because I think that's a vast thing that everyone can do, but through the church in particular. Just a spiritual way of thinking this: love, comfort, emotion, and intuition. Use all four of those to be a grateful and faithful person in our actions as a church, and trust each other, trust that we as Indigenous people can lead you. I'll just quickly leave you with this notion that was the response to 1986 apology that was given in 1988 at the 32nd General Council meeting, and it states that we only ask for you to respect our sacred fire, the creation, and to live in peaceful coexistence with us. The Native people of the All Native Circle Conference hope and pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity. So that's the big thing. Like the actions that the United Church membership can take needs to go beyond symbolism and has to be actual sincerity in action.
I believe we each need to look at the fact and accept it that history is history. The events have happened and we can't change them, but each one of us needs to take responsibility and heal ourselves and work towards passing that information on to each other. I always say that once you attend one of these meetings, that you become accountable for what you understand more, what you did before you joined us tonight. So now you're each responsible for assisting everyone to move forward, so that our children have a better future. I know that as a parent, my children have a better future than I had, and that my grandchildren have a better future than that, and my great-grandchildren are doing even better than that. So each one of our generations is doing better than the generation before, and that's each of our responsibilities. Allison, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Leanne. As Leanne said, just like taking the information and using it forward. The important thing to recognize, though, within reconciliation, I know that's a buzzword, but it's just like creating understanding between two people. Being here and joining the conversation and listening is a really important step. But it's not just you show up once and then you're done. You show up continually after. It's continual steps to help grow future generations. So I think that is a big thing to keep in mind, and just listening for sure. I'm going to pass it on to Jocelyn.
Thanks. Yeah, 1 minute. It's like hard to do. But I really strongly feel like we need to invest in the well-being of Indigenous children and young people. So to me, that means Indigenous early learning and childcare, absolutely. But having a national Indigenous youth program that is multi-purpose, that is driven by young people. I think if we use the exercise of what would I have done if I was at the height of residential schools, if I was who I am today, whether you're, involved in the church in some leadership capacity, whether you are just someone who attends and someone who's in community, someone who's non-Indigenous, if you have a different role in the community, somebody who is Indigenous, I would really take yourself through an exercise. What would I have done? What would I believe that I could have done in those times? And then take that and apply it to today, because it's probably still relevant. Yes, we don't have residential schools, but there's a lot that needs to still happen on the child welfare systems, education, recreation, all those areas that I had mentioned previously. So there's still lots of work to be done today. And I prefer to see resources go to community driven work. So who are the leaders, who's getting the money? If they're not Indigenous people, then that should raise a red flag for you. So those programs and initiatives that are led by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, and Indigenous people are getting paid in the process, at least to cover, the costs and supports. Those are the kinds of initiatives that you should be looking for locally. If it's not a friendship center, there's probably a local women's shelter, there's probably a daycare, there's probably something that you can find and say, how may I be of service? How may I help?
Springwater, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to take a question from the audience. It says, does Jordan's principle apply to Indigenous people whose rights were violated as children, but who are now adults? Can it be applied retroactively? Somebody want to answer?
I could probably start. I feel like Leanne has a lot of up-to-date information, but I can maybe look at some of the broader pieces. So generally, no, not through Jordan's principle. However, part of the Human Rights Tribunal decisions have been that restitution is warranted because of the violation of rights. And so that's kind of what the government and the parties are fighting over right now is, is what's the restitution, how much, and who is eligible. And right now they're saying any child that has had their rights violated as part of the child welfare system in the past. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Loki tells me to stop.
And it's not forever. It's back to 2006 at the current time, just so that people are aware that you can't be our age and be going back.
Thank you. This one here is open to everyone. Has anybody, can anybody speak to any resources that you have found useful in speaking about reconciliation, colonialism with young people, and perhaps if anybody has any perspective on speaking about those things from a faith lens? Any good resources that touch on reconciliation and colonialism that's youth friendly?
I'll put a link in the chat on the work that we did in reconciliation and child welfare, and there was a youth component to it. It's an idea, it's a framework to be applied, but it's not necessarily a program that's like actively rolled out, but it's one of the only ones that I'm aware of.
All right, so I do have something that keeps on popping up here. So it says here, I'd like to hear someone address the comment about young Indigenous mothers in the 60s choosing to give up their children for their well-being. My understanding has been that they did that because they had experienced the horrors of residential schools and wanted to save their kids from that. But I'd like to know what any of the panelists have to say about this situation. to whoever took some time out to write that. We will not be responding to this question. It's not fair to ask the panelists to provide answers regarding why Indigenous women gave up their children, and the assumption that it was a choice. And the choosing to give up their children for their well-being, for the child's well-being. Yeah, we're just not going to be going there this evening. Let me see here if there's any other questions. What role do you see the United Church of Canada playing in national and interdenominational reconciliation?
I could speak on that. So consulting with the community, for sure. This is hosted by United Church of Canada. So consulting with the community is a big thing. Just listening and being there to hear the stories and not make it as a promotion, like, oh, we're just doing this to like be part of reconciliation. It's more of hearing the stories and being there for the people and understanding how they could not fix past mistakes, but unlearn a lot of the stuff that the United Church was taught to believe. So, yes.
I like to add on to that. Right now, it's the process is that taking the leadership from our elders and National Indigenous Council on making steps forward. There's many different possibilities, as even what Allison was saying is just taking the action of listening, holding those sharing circles. We may even have an opportunity for that to be engagement in the National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering next year, and using that as part of another platform for more interaction, because that's part of it. Is we all have stories. Like I can. Everything that was been discussed tonight, like I just been having like backflashes of things, like, so we all have our stories from each generation to being raised in our society, and but I think it'd be further dialogue with the greater church leadership on making these actions happen. Even the kind of even going to the point of maybe going in partnership with other denominations and opening it up to greater talks with other denominations to expand this with other Indigenous youth from other denominations, making it grander, because the idea is Indigenous youth. We don't want to just stipulate just one denomination as well. We're all a church, we're all Christian, but we're our youth really matter in this in this initiative.
Any other final thoughts? Well, I'd like to say thank you to Murray, Leanne, Allison, Jocelyn, and Donna. I'm wondering, I know Donna, I'm wondering if you would be willing to say a closing prayer for this evening.
Okay. Could I say give you a small story?
Yes.
It's to do with the residential school and taking of children with the CFS. When I was a little girl, well, I'm a residential school survivor too. But when I was a little girl, before that, when we went outside to play, my mother used to say, if you see a bird's nest, don't touch it. Don't touch it. And we know that as human beings, we are no different from animals. We have the same laws as animals. So so I was always wary of that, not to bother a nest, a bird's nest. And I never really understood why. But she told me is if you touch a bird's nest, touch the egg, the mother bird will come, and she will know that it's been tampered with, her babies, and it'll crack the egg and throw it off the nest, like, because we have tampered with that. And I always feel that when the children are taken away from their parents, that's why we say, I didn't fit in with a family anymore when I went back, because we have the same animal instinct. So what I'm saying is, even though there's no more residential schools, we still have child welfare that takes away kids from their homes. Let's try not to do that, because you're tampering with the love of that family, and the child, and you're damaging the child's life right there and then. Yeah, I wanted to say that. Thank you. Okay, so I'm very honored to have been in with this meeting, and I will say a small prayer. Semen dumna kaksiwatsit. Numenen damen kuega kebamos kan kue yanumutamang kuega kue awasa kunji. If I can get the wastimna. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for giving us the opportunity to come together to discuss about our children, all our children who we love, that you have given to us. Negoes is bakuthin the man, where do you young? I was me who gabbets gently the man. When we do Jiang, where come at Jiang. We ask that you give us help, guide us how to be better people, to help each other, to walk in a good way together. Seven na so when I'm gonna ga when ga uziawa 20 to ganon we thank you for the panelists, and that you will help them with more work that they need to do, and that you will guide them. Lord, we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Miigwech, Donna, and thank you for everyone who logged on tonight. Just a reminder, tomorrow night, Murray's going to be leading a vigil at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.